Let's see. Okay, greetings from the Volland Store. It looks like I am in the Volland Store, but in fact, this is an amazing green screen backdrop of last year's Christmas decorations, but I thought that it looked especially festive and that it would be delightful to have it in the background today. So I'd like to welcome you to this special book reading and awards ceremony with Phong Nguyen. My name is Mindy Chaffin. I'm the new program director at the Volland Store. I just moved here from Oregon, and I gotta say, Kansas is beautiful, and it's a real honor to be here. If you are one of our loyal fans of the Volland Store, thank you for attending today and welcome back. If you have yet to visit the Volland Store, here's a little bit of information. So the Volland Store is a historic general store off of a windy road in the Flint Hills. It's very picturesque. It was almost torn down, but instead was renovated. And in 2015, it reopened as an art gallery and community gathering place. We are currently closed due to the pandemic, but we are still hosting visiting artists and using our downtime to develop a residency program where creative individuals will be given time and space to work on their craft in this beautiful rural setting. In March, we're hosting a traveling Smithsonian exhibit called Crossroads, Change in Rural America, and we are planning a robust virtual programming offering. And there is event information and also a limited number of Phong's books for sale on the Volland website at thevollandstore.com. So originally, this awards ceremony was scheduled for March, and with the pandemic, we had to reschedule. And I'm so glad we could all come together today through the power of the internet to award Phong Nguyen with the Garton Prairie Heritage Book Award. So Prairie Heritage wanted me to say a few words on their behalf, and they made a slideshow. So let me get that queued up. With the magic of screen share, you should be able to see the slideshow. Okay, so this honor is bestowed by Prairie Heritage, Inc., a nonprofit based at the Bird Runner Wildlife Refuge, a 320-acre prairie reserve in the Flint Hills. The $1,000 award is made possible by a bequest from the estate of Jan Garton, the Kansas conservationist who led the campaign to restore water rights to the Cheyenne Bottoms. Okay, how come it's not advanced? Oh, there it goes. Okay, dedicated to sharing the preservation of the prairie and its stories. In addition to making book awards, Prairie Heritage organizes history talks and collaborates with Juneteenth to lead stargazing and wildflower walks on the tallgrass prairie. Past history talks include One Kansas's anti-racism campaign, African American agriculture in Kansas, the Nicodemus connection to a vice president, and book talks on soldiers in the Army of Freedom. Jan Garton Prairie Heritage Book Award is given to the best book of the year that illuminates the heritage of North America's mid-continental prairies. More information can be found at prairieheritage.org. Previous winners of the Jan Garton Prairie Heritage Book Award include Ron Parks, Ian Michael Spurgeon, Ira Lee Bernard, Brent Campany, and the authors of Kansas Wildflower and Weeds by Michael John Haddock, Craig C. Freeman, and Janae Baer. Phong Nguyen is the winner of this year's award for his novel, The Adventures of Joe Harper. Phong is currently serving as the Miller Family Endowed Chair in Literature and Director of Creative Writing at University of Missouri. His stories have been given special mention in the Pushcart Prize Anthology and have won the Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley Award and the Inkwell Annual Fiction Award. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Phong Nguyen, and then I make your video feed happen by stop sharing my screen. And
Thank
do
you.
I click on him?
I don't think you have to. I think you should switch to me automatically because I'm speaking, but I don't know if that's right. It hasn't though.
I think that it has. Abby is
Oh,
shaking her
okay.
head yes. So over
Excellent.
to you,
Okay.
Phong.
Good. All right. So I start out by saying Happy Hanukkah to those who celebrate. And it's the first night of Hanukkah, and the sun is going down soon. And I wanted to thank you, Mindy, and to Patty for arranging and hosting this event. Special thank you to Margie Stewart and the committee for selecting my work for the Jan Garton Prairie Heritage Book Award, and to everybody for attending. I'm going to talk briefly about the novel. I'll read excerpts from the novel, and then I'll answer questions. So in 2016, I published The Adventures of Joe Harper, which is a spinoff from Mark Twain's Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The book was inspired by a particular quote from Tom Sawyer, which formed the epigraph of the book. That quote is, "As the two boys walked sorrowing along, they made a new compact to stand by each other and be brothers and never separate till death relieved them of their troubles. Then they began to lay their plans. Joe was for being a hermit and living on crusts in a remote cave and dying sometime of cold and want and grief. But after listening to Tom, he conceded that there were some conspicuous advantages about a life of crime, and so he consented to be a pirate." So my motivation for writing the book was this crystal clear picture of Joe Harper that the passage conveyed to me as this woe is me romantic amidst this gang of outlaws. Whereas Tom Sawyer is this natural born leader, the one who leads all of their adventures, and Tom Sawyer's gang is what it's called. And Huckleberry Finn is this kind of tag along ragamuffin, that they feel a little bit naughty by associating with in the first place. Joe Harper is kind of histrionic and sad and self-indulgent, and he's a partner to Tom Sawyer. So in my version, Joe Harper follows Tom Sawyer into a life of piracy. And after 10 years in pursuit of that life, he returns to St. Petersburg, which is based on Hannibal, Missouri, to find his home full of strangers and his mama Serenity gone from the world. And he decides to fulfill his lifelong dream of becoming a hermit and dying in a cave. What he discovers instead, or along the way, is a community of hobos, particularly a Chinese former railroad worker named Lee, from whom he learns about hermiting and hoboing, and an Amish woman named Ruth, who is fleeing from an arranged marriage. And when it came to Joe Harper, this is a character that was created by Mark Twain, but very little detail is given about him in the two books in which he appears. From Adventures of Tom Sawyer, we know that Joe Harper is Tom's best friend, his first mate. He's nicknamed Joe Harper, Terror of the High Seas, for the purposes of their fantasy games. He and Tom take turns torturing a tick. He has a dubious cure for warts, which, if you're curious, is that you cut open the wart with a knife, and then you take a bean, and then you rub the blood from the wart onto the bean, and you bury the bean, and then weeks later, you go and you dig up the bean, and once you find the bean, your wart's supposed to be cured. Now, of course, we know that this is just time passing, and the wart is going to go away on its own. You probably won't be able to find the bean in the first place. You bury the bean somewhere; it's hard to find a little bean. But that's one of his few contributions to literary history here. And he has trouble handling his tobacco. So when he and Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn go on Jackson Island, he and Tom Sawyer have to go off and pretend they're using the bathroom or something when they go throw up from using the tobacco. Then in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, we learned that when they raid a Sunday school picnic, Joe Harper comes out of it with a hymn book and a tract. But the moment that really came together, when Joe Harper's character came together for me, which inspired me to write the book, came from Adventures of Tom Sawyer and formed the epigraph of the book, which I read. I'm often asked what gave me permission to write in the world of Twain. And it was indeed a struggle to feel equal to the task. There are a lot of Twainish books out there, but for me, the moment that I felt that I had the right blessing to write the story was when I came up with the dedication of the book. And the dedication of the book is, this book is dedicated to Mark Twain, who, though I stand knee-high to his genius, would not, I believe, try to shake me off his leg. So the acknowledgement that I'm not trying to exceed his monumental accomplishments, and the hunch that I have that he would be amused by my attempts at mimicry, combined to give me the right disposition to continue the book and complete the book. Another thing that helped me was reading a book by Zachary Mason called The Lost Books of the Odyssey, which, as it sounds, is a retelling of incidents from Homer's epic. And the project of that book is the continuation of what historians believe is a work of collective authorship. And that really helped me question this sanctity of sole literary authorship as the gold standard for creative enterprises. The idea that I could be one link in the chain of a saga that was started by Twain became a very compelling idea to me, and one that I hewed close to. I was also influenced by an essay called The Ecstasy of Influence by Jonathan Lethem, which is a modification of Harold Bloom's idea of the anxiety of influence. Bloom's idea is that an author achieves originality through this agonistic rejection of their literary predecessors. So when you're writing, you have this sort of desire and motivation to remove yourself from your influences by separating yourself. Lethem suggests instead that a more fitting position in the postmodern world is to embrace the abundance and variety of influences. Because there's no such thing as creating out of nothing, right? We're always influenced by something, and that every work of art has a predecessor and some source of inspiration. It can be very freeing to adopt this creative philosophy of the ecstasy of influence. And one more thing I'll say is another thing I'm frequently asked is why I decided to include a Chinese immigrant, the character of Li, as a main character in the story. And this actually came out of my reading of Twain's work. He had a deep sympathy for the plight of Chinese laborers. And it's something that he expressed in his writing as early as the 1860s when he lived in San Francisco and worked at the San Francisco Morning Call, where he was the only beat reporter for the Call. And every morning he would go out, and what he witnessed was a lot of violence towards Chinese laborers and the indifference or even the participation of the police. And he would later write several profiles of Chinese immigrants for the Galaxy in his book Roughing It, and he would express support for Chinese students in Connecticut as well as sympathy for the Boxers. This humanizing of the Chinese American characters is totally consistent with Twain's priorities and sympathies, and I wanted to bring that to life in my fiction. Now, I'm going to read the first chapter as well as a selection from the middle of the book to give you a flavor of The Adventures of Joe Harper. Then I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end. You can just put that in the chat, and Mindy will be so kind as to read those aloud when the time comes. Yeah, I'm going to briefly break between chapter 1 and the middle of the book to set up what happens between. Chapter 1. The day had come to die proper. You mightn't think life had nothing more to offer a 35-year-old Joe Harper, but then again, you mightn't have abandoned all your kin and returned home 10 years on to find a St. Petersburg full of strangers. Or you mightn't have reached a body's threshold for sinning, when each day is a new excuse to poke an old wound. Or you just mightn't have been born with a bitter taste on your tongue and a holler in your heart. I've been pointed in the direction of hell a long time. Now I'd set my feet a-going. My compass read south, though I scarcely needed it to read me the right way. For all my folly and failures as a man, 10 years at sea had learned me to navigate by open sky. My aim was the Ozarks, a region rumored to have more oxbow lakes and karst springs than people in it. And I reckoned it would take me only another week, as long as I kept the sun on my left cheek in the morning and on my right afternoon. Half away to the prize now, I had just won the Keystone that day and was ready to celebrate alone with a sour drink and a crust of bread. I'd started out at Cave Hollow up where Injun Joe been buried alive. But since I didn't aim to remember my wayward boyhood every day till I growed old, I struck out for the Ozarks, where caves was plentiful and folks weren't known for asking questions. All I knowed for sure was that rather than listen to the current of the Mississippi, low the cliff face all day, pulling at me to drift on, soon I'd be hearing the soft slurp of waves on a rocky shore somewhere closed off from any other body of water. On the way down there, I ran across a one-road town with a saloon that had once been used to waylay travelers turning south from the east-west road. The burg itself was barely there, just the bones of buildings, with the houses spaced at such a distance from one another you wondered if the owners weren't being extra mindful of the range of buckshot. Their saloon was a former country home where rather than putting up bird feeders, it offered up its walls to woodpeckers. A porch had been hastily built to take in sudden business moving in the other direction, from south to north in the aftermath of Lincoln's War. It hadn't rained for days, yet the roof looked badly rained on. As for the old saloon itself, it was well occupied with rum-dums, though most was asleep or mighty close to it. Seeing my ragged shoulder bag and my generally hungry appearance, the proprietor cleared all the cash from the bar top and didn't mind that I seen him do it. His yaller hair flared out from his brow and temples like a lion's mane, and his beard of a slightly darker hue was trimmed to a point. Behind him were his wife and another feller, sleek as a leopard, who served drinks. "Where are you running from?" his wife says before I even take the stool. I hadn't made it far enough into the hills yet that I was rid of the hen mothers whose occupation was to nose into others' business. "St. Petersburg, but I ain't a running." She could see plainly I hadn't a pack to lay down, much less a horse to haul it on. The counter had used to be white with tan streaks made up to look like ivory, the one lavish detail in an otherwise rundown saloon, which had faded and soiled to a cracked brown. Even so, they judged me a vagabond, unworthy of sharing patronage with the drunken wastrels and assorted scoundrels who commanded the share of the room. My misfortune was that I'd have to wait till they were done a pestering me before I could get on my way and properly call myself a hermit on his way to a lonely death. "What are your plans?" she says. And I had sudden visions of Susie and Faith and Mama Serenity and Aunt Lily and Aunt Tom's Aunt Polly and the 1,000 women I growed up under and had at long last broken away from. "To live until I'm dead," I says. "Preferably someplace southern and lonesome." The barman nodded like he heard it all before, and I suppose he must have. "Think you'll find the right life there?" he says. His tolerance for brooding strangers was lower than the missus. The second feller kept checking over his shoulder, showing his whiskers, his face pockmarked like a leopard's skin. His arms were bare to show the work he put into them, I reckon, and the muscle moved beneath the skin like rats burrowing through a sack of feed. They was powerful suspicious of the stranger in their midst, I reckoned, and it was this other fellow's job to sort out suspicious strangers. I just walked in the door hardly, and it already brung back to me the reason I designed never to see hide or hair of another human being for the duration of my mortal life. Just the ordinary sort. I'd taken up too many high-minded dreams already. To this news he only nodded, for he couldn't have known how many years I'd spent following that rascal Tom Sawyer, drunk with the borrowed vision of a man worthy of the title Joe Harper, the terror of the high seas, and how much harm I'd done in the world trying to live up to that name. "You ain't unique," he says. The barman doesn't lie. "Leastways, you'll be warm," he says, "down south." His wife spat on the counter and scrubbed it fiercely, though the froth of her mouth did not to erase the filth that was caught between the cracks. I sat calm and pacific till I glimpsed they was both staring at me like a deer tick. "You got any 3-day loaves in back?" I asked. "You got any nickels?" he says. I was going to ask for the crusts if he had leftovers. "I don't store old food," he says. As a St. Petersburg boy, I reckon this was the height of human folly. None of your patrons is poor. The wise ones carry coins when they walk into a saloon, he says. "No," the wife says, as if to her husband, just loud enough to absorb from where I sat. "The wise ones move on, instead of taking a precious air lone jack." Her hint was blunt as a butter knife. "I guess I ain't wise," I says. "It's the foolish you ought to worry about," the woman says, slowly and full of hidden intention. "They get lost sometimes and you never hear from them again." The only thing that kept my mouth from pronouncing "this is lost, ma'am" was my manners from having been raised under those 1,000 women I told you about. "You got any spare rooms to let?" I ask. "You got any nickels?" the man says. I reached in my poke and fingered the 2 diamonds I kept from my pirating days. I weighed the risk of revealing them with the risk of starving, and judging that there wouldn't be another saloon on this road until the great saloon in the sky, I chanced it. Pulling them out of the poke and placing them on the bar top, I says, "Sorry, no, I only got these diamonds, and I don't aim to buy the building." She hit it well, but the wife, she flashed a wolfish smile. The barman, he kept a face of a stone lion. "I'll entertain your ruse and let on those are real diamonds," he says. "I suppose I'd give you a month's room and board for the biggin." "I suppose you won't," I says. "You never seen a diamond like this unless you've been to El Dorado." He looked at his wife, but she weren't taking her eyes off the diamonds. Though she was old enough to be sunken cheeked and worry lined and half the weight of her husband, you could see by the rim of her one wide eye that she was the one to be afeared. "All right, you can have the swill ale and crumbs, but I ain't cooking for you. One night is all you're welcome to." I judged the free food and drink would suit me, but I dasn't take a free bed. It could have been an act of Christian charity, I suppose, but I reckon these good country folks just wanted to rob this vagabond of his diamonds while he slept. So he meets up with and starts traveling with a former railroad worker named Lee, and he's still carrying these two diamonds from his pirating days. There's some words here that he picks up on the hobo road that you're going to need to know. A beau is a hobo. Cadging means begging. Yegging means stealing. And jackrolling means mugging. Okay? And a bull is a railroad security. Sooner or later on the road, you find yourself hungry and mean as a badger, and you must decide awful quick whether your line is cadging or yegging or jackrolling. The result has naught to do with the body's skill, but rather it has to do with how his mind is set, his tolerance for violence or risk or pity. For instance, Trombo would have made a legendary jackroller, being a boxer and a roughneck and big enough besides, but he fell to cadging for food because he never wanted to lay out a feller unless he deserved it. Most road kids, if taken under the wing of a profession, learn to cadge because they get more attention from being innocent young'uns. But left to their own devices, many a road kid lands on yegging, though precious few can outpace a bull. For me, though I was born with sympathetic features, long lashes like a girl, and dark eyes of appealing sadness, my pride kept interfering, and I couldn't even approach a mark to start cadging. And since I gave up pirating, the idea of jackrolling folks for their money seemed too much of the same. So I took to yegging. My first boodle was to lift some new rags, as mine was mighty sour, and between my boots and my trousers there were enough holes to make a cork stopper for a wine jug. Even though he swore he weren't a blowed in the glass profesh the way he'd let on, I could see plainly that Lee had more experience in the life than I had. So I fell on his wisdom once again. "How's a beau to find a wardrobe out on the road?" I says. "Well, some is gooseberries plucked from laundry lines, shirts and undergarments mostly, and some is mission clothes. You can get trousers that way since they'll fit you with a belt. Some is yegged from overland passengers would carry luggage and such. But when it comes to hats and shoes, Joe, you have to scrounge up a $50 or more. There's got to be some way a body can get shoes without buying them. Where'd you get your outfit, for instance?" I says. "Mine," he says, putting his hand to his chin like he had to think about it. He'd grown a wiry beard in the days since we met up, and I guessed that my mutton chops was bushing out in the middle by now. "From a lady friend who had extra rags around." "They seem to fit you fine," I says. "If I didn't know you already, I'd have thought you'd had it tailored, then ran it through the mud." Lee hardly seemed to notice me talking. "She was a good woman," he says, "and I'm a scoundrel." Lee turned distant and thoughtful, so he's no good for talk. But by and by I get my answer. Tramp around the train yard in Topeka for one morning, and a body will learn precious quick how a hobo gets a hat. A working feller, his head as bare as a baby's, ran around wildly through the crowd at the station, shouting at the Lord and all his flock that his Stetson was stole from his very crown. Then down in the jungle, I seen a whole gang of road kids sitting around a fire jawing, all of them with hats, and none of them that fit. I judged it would have been easy to take a hat off a road kid that morning, but I reckoned from our run-in with Jersey Joe the week before that even yeggs ain't supposed to lift from other bows. So I jungled up with the other bows and asked, "How's a body going to negotiate some new boots?" There's laughter, much as I expected. I shook my head. "When a body is broke and hain't had a proper meal for 2 days, it ain't the time for laughing," I says. "Bo, you just described the life of every tramp who slept out of doors, and it's just the time for a laughing. What else are you going to do?" This beau carried a bindle like he's ready to work at the drop of a coin. But no matter which direction you go in, there weren't any work in the jungle. To come back to me then, how different a life it was now, when the simple comfort of warm hands and feet that ain't sore and blistery seemed like an impossible dream, half remembered from long ago. Even on the high seas, there's always shelter below deck and a hot meal waiting summers to look forward to. And there was women aplenty, which kept me from going cabin crazy for the red years of my youth, but which always sent me yearning for a dank and lonesome cave. Then, when I come home after more than 10 years of pirate and learned that Mama Serenity was gone from the world, it seemed to be the only thought I could hold in my head. Now I was back in the company of strangers, looking on through a side alley as a parade of working men dressed in glad rags walked by with their hats on straight and their boots strapped tight and their keisters full of business. A thought occurred to me that has occurred to every tramping fool since the invention of poverty and idleness. Where are they all going in such a blamed rush? I've begun to see the stiffs the way they must look at the beaux. That is, like them stiffs don't hardly matter. Only pretend people bustle about, occupied with their daily business, while real folks put on their boots and go a roving. But here I am, broke, and I've got no boots. As I drifted off to the shatter world, I brought up one thought after another. Unless I got lucky and could ride blind baggage from here to San Francisco, I resolved that I weren't going to ride another car lest I had a hat, a scarf, a pair of boots, and some gloves. I had enough of the cold air of a moving train. Soon as I had this thought, though, I got a gut tingle, like I was socked in the belly by Jack Wanderlust. The notion of giving it up brought pain in my liver. I reckon I would have ridden the rods or on deck or summers between the two, as long as I still had ears to hear the mournful call of the train whistle. I even considered for a second whether my plan to find a cave and die in weren't the second best plan there ever was. When I rose up, the day had gone dark and Lee was pounding his ear in the bedroll. I must have outslept his shift, so the first thing I'd done was check to make sure I still got my poke, which I had. By then, I'd acquired the habit of tucking it on the inside of my trousers rather than outside, ties and all. When I felt a bug creeping on my neck, I jumped to my feet and swatted it. When I did, the bruises on my collar stung again like they was fresh. Down the alley, a body was walking fast in our direction, and from that distance, I wondered if it might be a bull coming to bust up some bows. But when it came close enough, I see it was just a street girl earning her daily bread. She was slim with puffy hair, one snaggly tooth, but a lot of different expressions she flashed quickly in and out of. Seeing I was awake and on my feet, she walked up to me and whispered, "They're rustling up the bumps tonight. I heard it in the stir." "You speaking true?" I says. I don't know how or when it happened, but I doesn't trust a stranger no more. The poorer and hungrier I got, the more I seemed to care about those diamonds I kept. "Come on," she says, tugging me along. "Wait," I says, "I need to fetch my partner." She looked down at sleeping Lee. "That Chinaman? Leave him be, Bo. I reckon the bulls won't want him neither. They got a regular jail, but no louse hotel for a Chinaman." So bleary from sleep, afeared of the bugs and the bulls, and taken in hand by a street girl who seemed to offer the soundest advice, I followed this slim, puffy-haired gal to the hook shop. It was only afterwards in the cat house that I wondered whether she meant to leave Lee alone or treat him to the kind of abuse he'd gotten in Kansas City and the town of Lone Jack and back home in San Francisco. If I ever confessed just how calm and comfortable I had become in a cat house, you'd think me an unrepentant sinner and worse. But that's the way of it for an old pirate. Living on the ocean is a fine life for some, but I reckon the company I kept back then was even low livelier than at present. And the brothels full of foreign women speaking in strange tongues was always a welcome refuge from the profane seafaring folk to whom a pirate otherwise indentures himself. Now I was soaking in a bath while my clothes were boiled to get the crumbs off. As me and my rags was both stewing in a pot, that street girl, whose name was Etta, undressed for her turn in the tub, and I was surprised to see that for her slimness, there was a small appealing pouch at her belly, and small appealing pouches across her chest. "Why should you want to take in a tramp and give him a warm bath and a tumble?" I asked. "You must have judged I have the means to pay. How do you reckon?" "Truly," she says. I nod my head as I suds up my arms. "Okay," she says. "I thought I'd ask. Some folks like to pretend they're special." "I've been around the block a time or two," I says, "so spill." "Well, I seen you stand up and check your poke," she says. Why else would a body get up in the middle of the night and check himself? So when I seen you were satisfied with what you found, I reckoned I'd be satisfied too. So they ain't a rustling the bums tonight, I says. In Topeka, she says, bums are getting rustled every night. But if you're wondering whether I'm going back out to the jungle, I ain't. You're my claim. She touched my cheek with her fingers, a bit motherly, and I wondered at her uncanny instinct for knowing a man's heart. If you want to know if a feller has $1 in his pocket, find a street girl to tell you. And if you want to know a feller's dreams and desires, ask his seducer. They are every one cleverer than tramps, more tenacious than working stiffs, and cannier than wives. I have to find Lee and get back on the road, I says, standing up and reaching for a towel. Etta took one and dried me off herself like she were a lady in waiting, patting it and gently to allow the cotton to absorb the wet, then replacing it with another dry one. You sure, she says, can't wait for your rags to dry? Suddenly I weren't so comfortable as I was on my way in. Here was kindness such as I've known in many a harem overseas, but something in me must have changed, I suppose. Maybe I was still a mourning the loss of my mama, or maybe I felt more keen a loyalty to my roadkin than I reckoned. No matter how I twisted, what it came to was that I suddenly couldn't abide a whore's false sentiment. Sensing the shift in the room, she walked back behind the changing screen, covered herself up with a robe, and handed me another dry towel while turning her head demurely to the side. There was her instinct again. It'd be better for you, Bo, if you turned around or ran a circuit by way of Nebraska, she says. I've heard it from 100 other freight hoppers. If you want to beat a train through Salina, you're going to tussle with Big Sur. And if you're going to tussle with Big Sur, you might come out of the other side of Kansas with a stump, if you come out of it at all. Big Sur, she learned me, was the name of a hound that was rumored to have crippled dozens of bows, maybe hundreds. The beast was trained, they said, to go for the limbs rather than the vitals, because deaths on the train yard are properly recorded in the public ledger, whereas accidents of the non-fatal kind are referred to the hospital, where if they bleed out, it's the bow's own business. But more often it leads to amputation, and she didn't ever want to see me lose my extremities. I went over to where my clothes was soaking, reached into my poke and plucked out the smaller of the 2 diamonds, then placed it in Etta's hand. For even when she learned I weren't an easy mark, she was still looking after my safety as I was asking for the door. Though I hadn't reckoned she'd shriek in surprise the way she'd done, an invitation for all the girls in the joint to pour in and croon over Etta's take. Pretty soon the word spread around until every last working gal was standing there in the room with me covering up my gentleman's parts. Somehow I kept myself modest. It's just the way I was brung up. All the ladies was a natural friendly, which about tore me in two, but I found that the wanderlust trumped the other kind. You can keep that diamond, it says, but I ain't got more, so could you repay a body's generosity with some clothes, a clean shirt, trousers, long johns, boots, gloves, and a hat besides? It took these hard-working women all of 60 seconds to scare up proper men's clothes I could fit into just laying around in a hook shop. As I made for the outdoors, walking through the low-lit hall, I passed by a row of abandoned fellers whose midnight conquests had all run into my room just to have a peek at my diamond. One otherwise respectable-looking gentleman, nearly my height and shape to the inch, stood around with only the clothes he was born in. I reckoned his old rags as my brand new ones, and I thanked him with the tip of his own hat. He turned away, though, too ashamed, I suppose, to be seen in the natural among the street girls of Topeka. When I opened the door, the sky poured in like floodwater, so thick with green clouds. They were strange clouds, too, hanging like udders from a long-bred cow. I stopped short upon the threshold, most blown back by the sight. This was a sky for tornadoes. Sure enough, a gust of wind sent me in the way I came out, and all the half-dressed and ain't-dressed men and women got thrown back that away too. My hat, of which I'd been so proud a half minute before, and even had traded my most worldly wealth for, was swept from my brow. I guessed it was near morning now, though a body couldn't tell for sure with them big mammaries hovering over us. I took a deep breath like I was fixing to dive in a river and made a run through the onslaught. Wind blowed hats and umbrellas around, so it weren't hard to get a hold of each. If I weren't so picky and took the first umbrella that landed in my lap rather than wait for a steel-ribbed one, I reckon I would have reached Lee sooner. As it were, by the time I reached the jungle, the sky was mostly dark, but full of sunlight yonder on the eastern horizon, where I weren't going. It quieted down like there never was a storm, though it was all around me now. A silent storm is a fearsome thing, for when the funnel cloud puts its vengeful finger on the earth by and by, All you will hear is a freight train bawling the jack like a cannonball, and then you're wiped from the world as though you was never born. I race through the alley till I find the place I laid my bedroll. Because of the unnatural quiet, the jungle was still at rest, undisturbed by bulls or tornadoes. And there was all the hobos of Topeka bound in an invincible, guiltless sleep. I stirred up Lee, and he came to slowly like a school kid trying to prolong the start of his morning lessons. Get on up, I says. We got to light out. He stood up quick and ready. Is the bulls after us? I shook my head. Who's after us? He says, tying his trousers and buttoning his now comically ragged coat. I pointed up at the sky, and Lee's eye follows my finger up to the firmament where the clouds are straining down but can't manage to find purchase in the prairie. The Almighty. Staring up at the storm gathering, Lee says, is that natural? Just get your bloomin' boots on, I says. The wind was upon us again, and t'other bows was rising with the sound of whistling and howling. What are you all riling us for? One beau asked me, the bindle stiff who was full of Wanderpath stories. There's a tornado coming, sure as daylight, I says. He shook his head. I wouldn't say there was a tornado coming, he says, and I looked at him queer-eyed. I reckon there's 7 or more. That's when I knew for sure. I can't understand a man who lives in Kansas. Don't it explain why I'm fixing to leave all the better, I says. Well, the beau says, scratching his lousy beard, can you really run from them? It seemed a sad and helpless thing to say, and I was eager to shake it off. But after I took a think, I got it up again. I've met a score of prairie philosophers since then who say the same, and I can't help but wonder if there's something to it. When the storm came in proper, it rendered the whole sky thick and clayey, and the sun turned pale like a full moon behind the wisps. But we started pad-footing it, thinking what an easy time a tornado would have lifting up me and Lee, both of us bone thin from too much roaming and too little food. Then my hermit guide had the brainstorm that would put to shame Archimedes and Isaac Newton. Lee noticed that the wind was blowing west, our direction, and he reckoned there was a handcart in the rail yard. He'd reckoned right. It was a mighty sturdy one, too. So we found us a gooseberry bush and yegged us a clean white sheet for a makeshift sail. The freshly starched fabric uncreasing with the expansion, its entire width strung to a crucifix of a mast we made from 2 cracked railroad ties, growing big-bellied in the wind. Then we cranked the handcart to get her started and let the hard gusts send us full west with no stops, waylays, or detours. It was not my fortune to have children or grandchildren, but if the other destiny had been mine, then this is the moment I'd say, and so kids, that was the day your granddaddy rode a tornado. I'll stop there for now. I see there's some questions there in the chat.
There are some questions. I'm going to read them out loud just so they get recorded on the recording. So Margaret, oh, thank you for reading. I really enjoyed that. And I did notice some hearts showing up on the screen while you were reading that you couldn't see. So that's always nice to know. Thank you, audience participants. Margaret Stewart wants to know what surprised you most in your research for this book.
I guess, the biggest surprise was how deep Twain's own compassion and defense of Chinese immigrants went. It was something that I was sort of vaguely knew about and read about because I've been teaching Twain for a long time. But it was not a popular subject at the time. But he championed the Chinese immigrants even to his own detriment. He had an argument with George Barnes, who was the editor of the San Francisco Morning Call, which led to him being fired. And partly it had to do with Barnes being angry that Twain was insisting on reporting on the violence done to Chinese laborers by Irish laborers and the indifference of the police. And his reporting on the police's inaction also led to the police finally arresting him for public intoxication. I mean, to their credit, he was actually publicly drunk, but they told him to leave town, right? And so, his leaving San Francisco, his losing his job, this moment in which he contemplated suicide is the lowest moment of his life that he described. It was the cause of that was his defense of and compassion for these Chinese immigrants. And so I think the depth of that and and the way that it affected him was one of the most interesting things I discovered.
That's cool. And a few different people are asking multiple questions, so I'm going to bounce around a little bit. So Chip wants to know, did you begin this book by outlining the story and the direction you wanted it to take, or did the story develop as you wrote?
It's a very good question. It's a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, right? And this is it's a picaresque. Its plot is sort of defined by their movement across the country to a great extent. And so in that way, I didn't need to spend a lot of time mapping out exactly what would happen from moment to moment to moment. I could leave a lot of room for surprise and serendipity. But I did know in broad strokes what would happen by the end. So, I knew well, I won't say what happens at the end, so, because just in case anybody wants to read it and be surprised. But I knew what would happen ultimately with Joe Harper and some of the major points along the way. But I didn't have to write an outline. I didn't have to map it out because my knowing the destination was enough. And yeah, so there you go.
Okay, and when you encountered Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer, what seeds did you see in the boy that led to your description of a violent, self-centered, opportunistic, conscienceless, even sociopathic man?
Um, well, at the end of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, there's this episode that scholars refer to as the evasion. And it's when Tom Sawyer commandeers the narrative and subjects Jim to farcically inhumane treatment, trying bringing in snakes and spiders and trying to, suggest even sawing his leg off at one point. And he cruelly extends his time of captivity, even though he knows that Jim is free this whole time, just to satisfy his boyish imperatives to have fun at the expense of Jim's freedom and his safety and well-being. So the seeds were really planted in that scene. I think Twain already did the work of showing the violent, self-centered, opportunistic Tom Sawyer. And in addition to that, one of the sources of frustration throughout the book, and a productive frustration throughout Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, is that you have characters like the Duke and the Dauphin, who, if you've read the book, they're con men, but wherever they go, they're so successful and they're trusted just because of the color of their skin. So wherever they go, they can roam freely, cheat people, and they're welcomed into every town they walk into simply because they're white. Whereas Jim and Huck are well-meaning, or at the very least harmless, and they're treated like criminals wherever they go because Jim is black. And so Tom Sawyer absolutely capitalizes on that privilege in the story, and is indifferent to Jim's well-being, and in fact adds to his suffering. So yeah, that aspect of Tom Sawyer, the path was already laid, I think.
Okay, if you had coffee with Samuel Clemens, what would you ask him, and would you like him?
Yeah, I'd probably faint. I don't know. I mean, I'd be so starstruck. I mean, he's my literary idol. I suppose I would ask him lots of questions about his intention, which, depending on the stage of his life, he might answer differently, because he's said a lot about his work that is kind of self-contradictory, and I'd ask him what the Angelfish Club was all about. Late in his life, he had this kind of club of young girls, and it's a little bit creepy, and I kind of wanted to know what that's about, and to clear his name, really, because I think that it was completely innocent and probably a sign of the times. But there's been some recent scrutiny around the Angelfish Club by things like Paris Review, just kind of pointing out that it's why a very old man would take interest in a bunch of young girls after the death of his wife. But yeah, I'd ask him to clear up some things just so I can hold my head high when I talk to my students about Twain, and be confident that he is the the upright individual that I believe him to be.
And it is difficult enough to write, but how did you learn the language of the poor, the country, and the backwoods people?
So this is what Twain called the Pike County dialect, and it was very difficult because all his Pike County dialect novels are written in the voice of a 13-year-old or 14-year-old boy. So I had to look at other sources, and there were a lot of people who were taking issue with Twain's own use, but I trust Twain and was kind of taking some aspects and mannerisms of Huck's that I thought would have been more universal of the dialogue, and then taking away others that I thought would be less universal. And some of the ones that stand out, I did write this book sort of between 2012 and 2015, so it's a little while ago now, but I remember encountering one source that was drawing a distinction between the Dixie Southern gonna and the Pike County going to. So going to, so you do elide the G, but you have, with an apostrophe, but it's not gonna, it's going to. And so it was, trying to be accurate to the time period, but mostly trying to do justice to Twain's own usage, but in a way that's convincing because I have a character who's 35 years old instead of 14.
Okay. And then were there really mines in Kansas that used convicted labor, or did you transpose slavery by another name from other parts of the country in order to have Joe encounter his historical moment?
That's a really good question. I feel like my answer is going to be unsatisfying. I don't remember. I mean, I did.
Oh,
I read about this, but the book was, as I said, was written, 8 years ago as I began it, and some of the research preceded that writing. And I read a lot of different books on a lot of different subjects, and I used what I felt was narratively necessary. My best guess would be that convict leasing was not used in Kansas during this time, or at least in the same way. Given its history as a free soil state, and that was founded by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which nullified parts of the Missouri Compromise. It doesn't seem like, especially during 1871, that this would have been the case. But it certainly was narratively useful, and I did get to talk about convict leasing and that slavery by another name, as Margie pointed out. So yeah, I suspect that it was not, but I can't say for sure.
okay. And Tom becomes the politician and moves to Washington. What parallels do you see with our cultural political situation today?
I guess the most salient thing would be Tom's gaslighting of Joe Harper and of Lee and of Ruth. So, in my book, Tom Sawyer consistently tells Joe in so many different ways, the truth isn't what you see with your own eyes. The truth is what I tell you to believe. And so when politicians proceed with complete indifference to the truth and use whatever, information is convenient, whether it's true or otherwise, that I think is reflected in Tom Sawyer's character and his behavior. There is that's the Karl Rove school of politics, right, where he said you just repeat a lie many times and it becomes the truth. That's not the way that it really works. I mean, especially when it comes to things like climate, right? So, we start to realize that there's so much more that is not a matter of perception, right? And those who are stuck in that very political thinking might fool themselves to think that they can control things with perception alone.
Okay, and then we have a few more questions. So Lee flees racist mob violence in California and returns 5 days later to racist mob violence, this time led by Tom Sawyer, with Joe once again as Tom's lieutenant. With Joe's sermon to the mob, a sermon that appeals to the mob's better angels while reinforcing the premises of racial prejudice, were you offering your readers a basis for hope for our society, or the opposite?
That's a really good question. I guess I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. I was thinking about it in terms of Joe's character. He shares the prejudices of his era and milieu, but he's still capable of sympathy for his friend. And despite his bigotry, he acts in Lee's defense rather than see him killed. So at that moment, the dilemma is, he thinks that it would be righteous to see him killed, but he still has this history with him, and can't go through with that, right? And so he rises to the occasion and calls off the dog, so to speak. Um, but but I hadn't really thought about it in terms. I mean, it's often the case that thoughtful readers are smarter than the writers that write this. This may be a case of that. Sure, that sounds great. That wasn't necessarily on my mind whether I'm extending a basis for hope or not.
And then there's a long and specific question. Okay, you take the historical figure of the eccentric, possibly schizophrenic British American who called himself Emperor Norton First of the United States and Protector of Mexico, and run with it, adding your own creative touches, making him of Chinese heritage and connecting him to the Queen Dynasty. Then you portray Lee as a subservient to this character, but true to Lee's own code of honor, what Lee feels he owes a guest whom he could not protect, what he feels he owes to Chinese tradition. Yet all of Lee's honorable tenacity is shown to be subservient to a San Francisco lunatic. In this way, Lee's inner code parallels Joe's. Both are under the sway of questionable characters and derived from questionable institutions. Are you saying the codes we live by are all connected to some sort of absurdity?
Well, I should clarify. Probably some miscommunication there, but Emperor Norton the First is still British American in the book. He's not Chinese American, but he's being spoken to by Lee as an ambassador, who is revealed has gotten this the final dying words of somebody who represented the Qing dynasty. And so, as far as the what is it, the codes we live by are connected?
Yeah. So are you saying the codes we live by are all connected to some sort of absurdity?
That sounds very good. I would like to say that I'm saying that. Yes.
Hooray. And then Chip wants to know about your name and your parents' background and where you're currently residing.
Sure. I think my parents are probably here on this call, watching this event. My mother is from Wisconsin, and my father is from Vietnam. He grew up in Nha Trang. He came over to the U.S. in 1962 on scholarship, and he became a citizen in the 70s. We were all born. Well, actually, I say we. My brothers were born in Canada. I was born in Boston. And I currently live and work in Missouri, where I've been for, I guess 14 years now. And before that, I was in Wisconsin for 5 years. So I'm pretty Midwestern at this point.
And I think that's all the questions. I have a question. I know that you have a new book coming out, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk about it a little bit.
Sure. Yes, I'd be happy to. The book, which is currently scheduled for release in a little more than a year, in February of 2022, is called The Bronze Drum, and it's about the Chung sisters. And the Chung sisters are kind of Joan of Arc figures of ancient Vietnam. It's sort of set in the Bronze Age, around 40 A.D., and it's about the uprising and the revolution of these sisters who raised an army of 80,000 women and fought off the Han Chinese occupation of ancestral Vietnamese land. And that their war, even though their reign was short-lived, they only reigned for 3 years as queens. It became sort of the precedent for the independence of Vietnam 1,000 years later. So this one also required a lot of research, probably a lot more research, and as it was set, 2,000 years ago, and halfway across the world. So yeah, that's the story in summary, and it's coming out through Grand Central Publishing, which is a division of Hachette, and yeah, you should be hearing about it in a little less than a year.
Yay, well, thank you. And I don't know if anybody has, it doesn't look like any more questions are popping up. So I think we are ready to have this book ending come to a closing. I see some applause. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you
And
all.
oh wait, there's one new message. It says clap, clap, clap. So
Thank you
so
so
thank
much.
you.
Yeah, thanks to Patty and thanks to Margie, and it's really an honor.
And thanks for everyone for joining us today. So with that, we are going to close the Zoom meeting. Thank you very much.